Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the next session, as part of our resource data management series. Today's session will be on secure data sharing. I just want to check before we continue if I'm audible to anyone who's actually attending virtually. All right, perfect. So without further ado, what we're going to do today is we'll kick off this session by focusing on the sharing of research data in a secure manner. Now, previously, the sessions, or at least the last two sessions, have focused on the manner in which sensitive research data should be managed. And we looked at data anonymization, privacy, de-identification, and re-identification on Monday. We followed this up today by focusing on information security best practices. And we also looked at data storage and data backups, encryption, amongst other things, access control, authentication. And today, what we'll do is we'll add on an extension to that, which is the secure data sharing component. That is, we focus on how you keep the data secure in terms of people being able to access the data or penetrate any barriers to the data. But what happens when a researcher wants to actually get the data from point A to point B, or from themselves to another individual or a few other individuals? What do you do then? And that's basically what this session will actually focus on. Now, just like in the past few days, I'd like to start off with a little bit of a recap on what it is that research data management actually amounts to. Just for the benefit of anyone who's actually just jumping into one of these sessions for the first time, I have to be honest, if you actually haven't been with us from the very first day, you would have actually missed out on a bit. But rather than referring you to the previous videos and then asking you to come and watch this one, you can sit through this session, but I'll just run through a quick recap so you familiarize yourself with the concept of research data management. So before getting to the definition of research data management, we start off by considering what research data are. And research data are defined as any data collected or generated for the purpose of analysis in order to generate or validate scientific claims. And the research data may actually take various forms, as you can see on the screen at the moment. Now, from the definition of research data, you then arrive at the definition of research data management. Okay, research data management has been defined as a process which entails two things: planning for the manner in which research data will be managed during and after a research project, and secondly, controlling the collection, processing, analysis, sharing, dissemination, curation, and reuse of research data. Now, what I indicated previously is that generally speaking, researchers and people out there make use of the research data management lifecycle to depict the process of research data management. And in terms of the lifecycle that we're actually using now, is based on a six-stage lifecycle, starting from data management planning, which is really the first part of the definition, and then the rest of the other stages would capture the second part of the definition. Now, this lifecycle can actually be depicted in tabular form, as you can see on the screen right now. And in terms of what we'll be focusing on today, there's relevance with regards to the data management planning stage, and then data sharing, which is something that you'll see pops up not only during the data dissemination stage, even though that's what you see on the screen. Technically, you can share the data soon after you've collected the data or after processing the data. It may not be something that only happens when a project comes to an end. So that's just something you should keep in mind. Nevertheless, the principles are about to be the same. Now, let's go to the data sharing principles. And before I commence, I do want to point out that in the last two sessions, our focus was on sensitive research data that are sensitive due to data privacy reasons. I didn't focus on intellectual property as well as research contracts. And that would be a similar thing today, but as you come to understand during today's session, these principles are most certainly also applicable to research data that are sensitive due to intellectual property or research contract reasons. That is, data that may be sensitive even though they do not necessarily contain personal identifiers. So let's look at the data sharing principles. But before going off into looking at the principles, I like to start off with anecdotes, just like yesterday. So today I'll start off with the story of a paper that was written by Carmen Reinhardt and Kenneth Rogoff. I'm not sure if any of you are actually familiar with any of these individuals. No show of hands. If there are any economists or anyone who's studying economics who's actually attending, you might just be aware of who these are. These are economists. One of them was actually a prominent member of the World Bank. And over a decade ago, they published a paper known as, or titled, Growth in a Time of Debt. That's what they look like. And just to give you a bit of background about this, in 2008, there was a global credit crunch. Most of you will probably be aware of it. There's a financial crisis that actually started off. And then as a solution, it was proposed, at least in this paper, that what certain countries could do is to adopt austerity measures. Now, if there's anyone who remembers what happened back then, around 2009, Greece actually came under severe financial strain, and the Greek economy was on the verge of collapse, and Greece was actually going to default on its obligations, its financial obligations. And essentially, Greece was bailed out, and it actually had to adopt several austerity measures. If you watch the news back then, you see that there were protests in Greece. A lot of people were very unhappy about this, and it happened several times. Now, it's interesting to learn that this paper was published in May 2010, and it advocated for certain steps, policy directions, or policy stances to actually be taken. Now, I'm not going to say that Greece as a country was only influenced by this paper, but these are prominent economists. They are staff members or were staff members at Harvard University, and one of them was at the World Bank previously. But interestingly enough, a few years later, after this paper had actually been published, what happened is there was a student, I think it was a postdoc student, he was a postdoc fellow in Canada, who actually worked on this, did some research and had a look at this paper, and he decided to get hold of the research data that actually influenced these findings. And the research data had not necessarily been shared publicly. So what he did, he actually wrote to the authors and he asked for the data to be sent to him. And the research data were actually shared. And he had a look at the research data, and lo and behold, he came to find that there was some errors in the data, that the research data did not actually support the findings that you found in the research publication. So he gladly wrote up his own publication. He published that to refute what Reinhardt and Rogoff had actually published. So you can go and look up that article. I don't have it listed here, however. But what I want to point out is, by then it was a bit too late for Greece, because essentially what this postdoc stated is that Greece should have never actually ever adopted austerity measures, and that is actually what had actually happened. So the paper was published after perhaps 2012, after several rounds of austerity measures, and that certainly is not something that's going to leave people in Greece very happy. But what I want to highlight is that this actually underscores the importance of being able to share data, at least being able to access data. You can actually discover whether or not people made fraudulent claims, or sometimes there may be errors that were actually made. In this case, it's not that Reinhardt or Rogoff actually deliberately tried to pass off false findings. They themselves were not necessarily responsible directly for the mistakes. It was actually somebody else, but that nevertheless influenced the findings. The data were basically skewed. So long story short is there is significance in sharing research data, and some of these things may actually emerge after the fact, and they may actually be seen as unforeseen circumstances. But that's just a good classic case of sharing data and the benefits of it. Now, that being stated, let's actually define data sharing. As you know, I like to work off of definitions. In this case, you can draw a distinction between data sharing and data dissemination. So data sharing in this case refers to the peer-to-peer transmission of data privately between researchers and other parties. So the key thing is that the data will not necessarily be public. So you can send it by email, or if you use some kind of file transfer system, you can share it with one person or perhaps a few other people, but the data are not being shared broadly in the public space. Whereas when you look at the concept of data dissemination, you're looking at the publication of data through some form of a public setting. So that could be ideally some kind of website, or you can publish the data through a data. So when we're speaking of research data sharing today, secure sharing of data, we're not looking at public sharing. And I state this because when you look at the literature out there, what you'll find is that these terms are actually used interchangeably. But I align with the school of thought that believes that these terms should not be used interchangeably. So just as a working definition for the rest of the session, we're looking at private sharing, so to speak, of the data, or rather the private transmission. So how can people actually share data? Well, there's more than one way. Firstly, you can share data locally, or you can share data through collaboration. So when I say local data sharing, I mean by way of actually just sending someone directly. You send the data to someone by email, or if it's a file transfer system that you're using, you can send it directly to the person. Or you can have a research collaboration where you're using some kind of system that actually allows multiple individuals to actually sign in and actually have a look at the research data. So you provide access to several individuals. So that could be a team of researchers all being able to access a data set or several files. So those are different ways to which you can actually share the data. But notice that in both cases, the data have actually not been made publicly accessible. So just to carry on there, data can be shared by means of, and I've alluded to this, a direct file transfer to one or more individuals. The two, you can use software applications that permit the collaboration of several individuals. This is just basically repeating what I just pointed out. And in both instances, the data can actually be shared intra or inter-institutionally, so within an organization, such as Rose University, by way of example, or between Rose University and another institution, and vice versa. So let's look at the mechanisms for sharing research data in a secure manner. Now, in this case, I'll show you several examples of several software platforms. And that's not to indicate that all of those are actually in use at Rose University. Some of them are actually more suitable for sharing research data than others. So by way of example, we've got OneDrive for Business, which is something that can be used for sharing files. It might not necessarily be the most optimal solution for sharing your research data. There's Microsoft Teams, which can also be used for similar purposes. We have Google Drive. Rhodes University has an institutional Google Drive subscription. That can be used for sharing files. It's not necessarily the most optimal solution for sharing research data, not necessarily fit for purpose. And then there's also Alfresco. Alfresco is a system that I've discussed previously. And I did indicate that technically you could use it for managing some research data, but it is not a fit for purpose solution that was designed from the ground up to be used for the management of research data. This is really a content management system. And even though data can qualify as content, it's not really meant to be, it's not meant for the management of research data, but it could be a compromise solution. The other examples that I'll show you are actually more suitable options. So the first one that you see here is REDCap. This is used primarily in the health sciences field for clinical trials, etc., for data sharing purposes. But mind you, there are limitations in the sense that it only has things such as questionnaires and can be used for longitudinal studies. There are limitations in terms of the video files as well as audio file sizes that can actually be uploaded onto the system. So it's not necessarily suitable for every type of research project that would be conducted. But nevertheless, for those that do qualify, REDCap is something that can be used for data sharing purposes. Then you have Figshare. Figshare is actually repository software. So Rose University does have a subscription to Figshare. This is really meant for sharing research data after a project has come to an end. The system itself does actually have a component that does allow researchers to share data primarily by way of research collaborations. So I just want to indicate that this is something that is technically feasible. However, this is also not necessarily the most optimal solution for sharing research data, primarily due to security reasons when it comes to access controls and things of that sort. Or being able to use documents such as the data sharing agreements. These are not built into the system, so you can literally grant access to someone without using a data sharing agreement, and the person can access the data and they can do just about whatever they want with the data in that sense. So you'd rather use a system that would allow you to at least project or at least give them access to a data sharing form so that they can agree to certain terms and conditions of use before they proceed to use the research data. I'll give you some more information about data sharing agreements later on during this session. Now, one of the systems that is really suitable for data sharing and research collaborations is something that is known as Open Science Framework. This is a tool that was built, at least from the ground up, to facilitate open accessibility of research data or open accessibility of content in the general sense, and it can be used for managing research data. This is particularly ideal when you're looking at the active phase of the research project, that is during the data collection, processing, and analysis phase. That is before the project has actually come to an end. You can use a tool such as Open Science Framework. It is freely available online, and I should indicate that Rhodes University does not actually have an institutional instance of Open Science Framework. It is something that's possible in the sense that this is open source software, so an institution can actually adopt this and have its own installation of Open Science Framework. The reason why I'm mentioning this is because we're looking at sensitive research data here. And as things stand, the servers for Open Science Framework are in the cloud. They're actually based in the United States. And you don't necessarily want to just take your sensitive research data and export them, so to speak, have them residing in the US if the data are actually sensitive in nature. Hence why I say that you might actually want to have a local installation if that is actually possible. So you make use of the software, but you also want to make sure that the storage is actually suitable. Then we have File Sender. File Sender is a system that actually facilitates the transmission of data rather than research collaborations. This is something that you use in order to send data securely instead of making use of email platforms, for example. Now, what's interesting is that a number of people might sit there and think that emails are actually fine. You can just use Gmail or you can use Box or Dropbox. And I'm not sure how many of you would be aware that several years ago, Gmail was actually hacked. If you go back to, I think, the pre-pandemic time, Gmail was hacked, Box was hacked, and Dropbox was hacked as well. And these are the free versions of these software. And there's a reason why these things are free. The subscription version of the software would be bound to be more secure than the free version. So if you're using the free Gmail version to send your research data, it's not as secure as, let's say, the Rhodes version that we have, the subscription to Google software, and that is bound to be a bit more secure. Nevertheless, it's more ideal to use something that is built from the ground up to cater to the actual transfer of the research data. And that is where File Sender comes into the picture. I'll provide you with a bit more information about File Sender because it is actually the most ideal solution that I've shown you here, and something that Rhodes University does actually have access. Now, the way that File Sender works is that this is actually supported by SANREN within South Africa, and as a result, several South African universities have access to this tool. The way it works is that it actually encrypts the data once the data are in transit, so confidentiality can actually be ensured. And below is a list of some of File Sender's features, or at least service constraints, but same thing in this case. You can send up to a maximum of, or you can send out the data to a maximum of 50 recipients. The maximum number of files per transfer is 30. You can send up to 100 gigabytes of data. This is a better solution than just using generic email services. There was talk of getting this from 100 gigabytes to 1 terabyte, but I'm not sure if that's something that has actually been successfully implemented as of yet. So I'll stick to the 100 gigabytes. It works for large files that you want to share. The maximum size for files listed there is 2 gigabytes. That is for non-HTML browsers. And what you need to know is that the transfer files sort of like are deleted after several days. So you send a file, but it won't remain permanently on File Sender servers. So after 10 days, it's sort of like the link expires. So you'll see how this will make more sense. The software sends a link, someone downloads the file after clicking the link. The link then expires after 10 days. So if someone hacks into the system after, let's just say day 22, they'll find nothing. And there's a guess expiry date of 20 there. Now, I want to just elaborate a bit more on how a file sender actually works. What happens is you just drag and drop your files into the system and you send it off. It's like email. You list who you want to actually receive the files and you send them. So it's really easy to use and it's very intuitive. What happens is the recipient gets an email that looks something like this, and there's a link that they click and they download the file, the very large file. You just need to make sure when you upload the files that they do reflect that they've actually been uploaded before you press send. Now, what happens is after you've actually sent the email and the recipient has actually received it, you can get a notification to indicate that the email has actually been received. And furthermore, when it has been accessed by the recipient or recipients, you get a notification email indicating that the files have actually been downloaded. So there's some kind of audit trail and confirmation from your side as a user. And then eventually, after 20 days or so, when the file's lifespan comes to an end, be deleted, you'll get an indication that the files will actually be deleted, or at least the recipient will get an email prompting them or nudging them, informing them that the files will actually no longer be accessible. So the idea is that they need to actually download the files before then. This is what the interface looks like. And if you actually had to log into it, what happens if you click your way through it, you'd see the list of universities that can actually make use of file sender in South Africa. And you simply have to then find Rose University. You click on Rose University, and then you'll actually log in. You will use your same Rose University credentials, login credentials that you use on campus. So your Rose University username, your Rose University password. There is an authentication mechanism that has been set up with Sapphire. It's an authentication entity, if I can put it that way. And basically, in short, you will use your Rose University credentials to access the system. That is something that has been set up for all South African, or at least most South African universities. That's why I've recommended this tool. It's ideal and you can use it as of today. Now, just practically see how this works. I'm going to play a short video. Now, this is for a file sender instance from another country. So several countries do use file sender. Samren manages it in South Africa, and we've got ANET, which manages it in a different country. But the principles in terms of how the software works are bound to be the same. So let me just play that for you right now.
File Sender is a service from HEAnet available to all staff and students in Irish higher education. Click to log in and choose your institution. So for us, IT Carlow. And use your college username and password to log into the system. When you've logged in, you will be able to choose who you send your message to. So here, I'm going to send it to elearn@itcarlow.ie. And you can choose a subject, so file for you. You can give an optional message. You can set the expiry date, which can be up to 1 month in advance, or obviously shorter. So here, I'm going to just set it to go to 3 days' time. And then you can choose your file that you wish to attach. Navigate to where you want the file. So I'm going to attach this PDF document. You can choose to encrypt the file, and you can send the password to de-encrypt the file separately to the person you're sending the message to, but you must accept the terms and conditions. Click send, and it will upload the file, confirm that it's been sent successfully, and you will get a copy of the email, and the email will go to your user. What's also very useful is that when the person you've sent the file downloads the file that you sent them, you'll get an email confirmation that the file has been downloaded. That's it.
I just wanted to show you the actual visuals instead of just talking my way through it. Now, let's proceed to the data transfer agreements that I referred to. Early on, I mentioned that you'd actually want a data transfer agreement, someone referred to as a data sharing agreement. This is something that actually ideally should be in place. If you're actually sharing files between your home institution and another institution, you actually need to provide some kind of legal document that outlines the manner in which the recipient should use the data or is permitted to use the data. There may be some restrictions, especially if the data in question happen to be sensitive. You want to have guardrails in place. For instance, if you send a file with personally identifiable information, you would want to ensure that the recipient is not just going to take the files and then publish them, etc. They also need to manage them in a very secure manner. And you want those kinds of things to be part of the data transfer agreement, so that in as much as you would also want to manage your data in a secure manner, you'd also want the recipient, who could be a research collaborator at another institution, to also have certain guardrails in place. For instance, they should also have access control, maybe multi-factor authentication if the university has those things in place. That's something that you'd want to be reduced to the form of a data transfer agreement. This was one of the reasons why I say that you probably wouldn't want to use Figshare for data sharing purposes, because the platform allows you to open up a research project to anyone to actually just collaborate without actually completing any data transfer agreement. And in that case, you can definitely say that you're opening yourself up to a risk. So to avoid that, you'd rather use a platform that can allow you to use something like this. Alternatively, if you're using something like FileSender, you can send the data transfer agreement to someone before you actually proceed to send the data. Now, this is usually a case for extremely sensitive research data, but maybe medium risk data. For extremely high risk data, you probably wouldn't want the data to be transmitted between those in another institution. There will be other solutions that you can use, which I will show you. Most notably, what's known as a trusted research environment. Now, just as I indicated yesterday, in as much as we would want research data to comply with the fair data principles and also be open in nature, certain research data are sensitive and cannot actually be open and must therefore be part of the compromise solution, which is what you find on the bottom right-hand corner here of this quadrant, where the research data are closed and fair. And that is what secure research data management platforms actually allow you to accomplish. Now, it's important to understand that there are different degrees of openness. So you can have level 0 here that you see, that is data that are only accessed by a data controller. Let's just assume that is you as a researcher. And then you can share the data. If you move on to level 1, where you discriminate in terms of who gets to access the data. So the data could probably be accessed by the data subjects, that is the research participants, or in other cases, it could just be you and your academic supervisor. Or if we move to level 2, where there's a bit more control, if you're part of a research project, you could grant access to several members of that research project, your collaborators on the project. And then you get to the third level, that is level 3, open data. And that is a case where your research data are actually made publicly available. Everything that we've discussed thus far today falls between level 0 and level 2, because that is what amounts to data sharing. In fact, level 1 and 2, because level 0, the data are closed off and not being shared with anyone at all. Now, for those of you who've attended the previous sessions, you actually should have noticed that this has parallels between what I pointed out yesterday when we discussed access control, primarily when we went through role-based access control, in terms of which certain permissions are assigned to certain individuals, allowing them, based on their roles, to access the data and do certain things to the data. So either being able to read the data, or being able to edit the data, or being able to delete files, add content to the files, etc., which would amount to the editing part. Now, generally speaking, if you were to zoom out and just look at best practices for sharing data safely, you can adhere to what are known as the 5 data sharing principles. Others just call them the 5 safes. That is, you want to look at the project, people, settings, the data, and the outputs. Now, I will just go through these very briefly. We won't actually be able to unpack each of them in detail. But when you start looking at the people, you want to make sure that the data are shared only with authorized users. So this speaks to things such as the access control that I mentioned, and it relates to things that I would have discussed yesterday. You don't want someone who is not authorized or should not be accessing the data at all to gain access to your research data. So that's something to keep in mind. You address that generally through things such as access control mechanisms. 2, look at the settings. You want to use the data in a safe and secure environment. This has to do with the technology that you actually utilize for data sharing purposes. So I showed you several examples of systems that can be used to share data, but may not necessarily be fit for purpose. You want to use the most suitable options for sharing your research data, rather than systems that should not be used at all. And that being stated, you don't want to use, let's say, portable means of storage. For instance, share your data by simply downloading the data onto a flash stick and handing it over to a friend, or taking an external hard drive, downloading the data onto that hard drive, and then shipping it off to someone else. That's not really the best way of sharing your research data. Thirdly, you want to consider the data as well as applying appropriate protections to the data. This is something that we would have actually addressed yesterday. So obviously, before someone actually accesses the data, and this goes beyond the passwords and things of that sort. You want to make sure that the data are backed up. You want to have access controls. You also want to be able, or want to use a system that can support multi-factor authentication, so that people can actually validate themselves and prove that they are who they claim to be. If you can, you could also make use of encryption as well, just to make sure that the data are actually secure. And this refers to things such as the barriers that I referred to, so that people will not be able to compromise the data or the integrity of the data. You want to make sure that the data are actually protected. And you would obviously look at things such as the identification of the research data as well. But in cases where the data are still sensitive and contain their personal identifiers, you'd be looking at what I'm referring to right now. That's everything that we covered during yesterday's session. Then you want to look at the outputs as well. That's the fourth aspect. Ensuring public outputs from data sharing projects do not identify the people or organizations in the data. So this speaks to what we covered 2 days ago. That is when we look at the proper de-identification of the research data in a manner that prevents someone from re-identifying the data, or at least limits the degree to which someone can actually re-identify the data. So that happens through proper data de-identification techniques. And then finally, the fifth thing, that is the projects. That is sharing data for appropriate and authorized purposes. You don't want to just share data for any unauthorized reason. If you're conducting a research project and you collect research data, then you undertake to share data. However, you would de-identify or remove any personal identifiers, and then you would actually share the data in support of your research findings, of your research project. It would not make sense to share any sensitive data that would certainly not support the research project, and it would obviously expose the university to some kind of lawsuit or at least legal action from the research participants, or even some kind of sanction from the information regulator. Now, some of these things are pretty much repeated to a large degree on the next slide here. So in terms of safe people, you want to have only trained and specifically accredited researchers who can access the data. I previously mentioned that you want to make sure that people who are managing research data or are part of a project are well-versed in the techniques that need to be applied in order to manage the data. As a result, it would be important if such people do not have such skills for them to actually go through some kind of training so that they can actually handle the data appropriately. When you look at the projects, so again, the data should only be used for ethical, that is approved research purposes. So if your data has actually gone through the ethics system and you've received ethical clearance, then you should be aware of the best practices, the ethics principles that you should actually be applying to the management of your research data. Most notably, the identification of the data. We'd assume that you've already received informed consent, or that you have legitimate interest to actually collect the research data in the first place. The safe setting aspect is something that I've already mentioned, but what I would like to point out is that one of the safest options here is what's known as a tree, so that data can be accessed by using a secure system. So I did mention that you could use data transfer agreements in order to allow you to transmit the data. But the safest option is actually the use of what's known as a trusted research environment. In short, a tree. And a tree is a system that allows us to then access the data. So it's people coming in towards the data as opposed to the data being sent out to them. I'll show you a bit more about that, or at least I'll cover it in the next few slides. But that is a system that is probably the most optimal solution where applicable for highly sensitive data. You always want to keep the data safe. When we look at the safe data icon there, that is researchers should only use data that have been de-identified to protect privacy. You can take that one with a bit of grain of salt. Sometimes, in order to get the best utility out of the data, you might want to work with data that have not necessarily been de-identified. But if the data are going to be shared publicly, then they must actually be de-identified. And I state this because we've received that question. What if the data lose their utility because I've de-identified them so thoroughly? And as I pointed out on Monday, there are different techniques that you can use, some of which will actually reduce the utility of the data far more than others. So there's a balance that actually needs to be struck there. But the key thing is that the data must actually be safe so that ultimately they're de-identified and then published. But even as you work on the data, it is noteworthy that you can work with sensitive data without de-identifying, provided that they're in a secure environment. And finally, safe outputs, that is all research outputs need to be checked to ensure that they cannot be used to identify subjects. This goes back to the re-identification risk that we spoke about on Monday. So after the data have been de-identified, you need to make sure that the data do not succumb to any of the re-identification techniques that can actually be used, so that someone should not be able to reverse engineer the process or to make use of some publicly available data set in order to identify the individuals who are part of the project. So at that point, you can conduct that kind of reassessment just to make sure that the research data are actually not re-identifiable, so to speak, or at least the individual identifiers are not re-identifiable. Now, previously, I did make reference to a trusted research environment, and what you can see here on the screen is an example of such a system. This is a proprietary tool. It is known as KeyPoint, and the university does not have a subscription to KeyPoint. I just want to point that out. But the way that KeyPoint works is that it is something that would be installed at an institution, and you can actually have, what you find is that in this particular example, there's certain software that is already pre-installed on KeyPoint. And the examples you can see are Microsoft Office, Excel, Stata, R, Python, SPSS, and SAS. Basically, statistical analysis software with the example of Microsoft Office and Excel, obviously. And the key thing is that you would actually have data uploaded into the tree, analyze the data within the tree. If anyone wanted to access it, instead of you sharing the data and sending it directly from the tree, the individuals would actually have to gain access to the data directly by using the tree environment. So this facilitates some form of research collaboration in a secure manner, rather than having data be transmitted to someone else externally. And the way it works is that it's essentially a data vault. And as you can see from the illustration here, you have the data custodian here who actually has a data sharing agreement that is used within the system, so that if someone wants to gain access to the data, that is, you have got the data steward who actually manages that data sharing agreement. And if anyone wants to actually use the data, they'll be vetted, and they will actually have to sign that data sharing agreement before they can even gain access to the data. And then that person is allowed to access the data within the confines of that data vault. The data do not move out of the vault, because the person who's granted access to the data in that secure environment, but the data do not exit this secure environment. This is why I stated that this is the most optimal solution. In some cases, you can find that this is something that is established that is on premises, and people need to actually access the data using specific workstations in a specific room on campus. So by way of example, it could be a certain office that has 5 computers, and you can only access the trusted research environment by using those 5 workstations and no other workstations on the campus at all. And those workstations would not have access to the internet for very obvious reasons. That is one way through which this could actually work. There is another example which is not necessarily included in the slides. It's known as Data Shield, and this is something that can work as part of a network. So I believe this might be cloud-based, at least in the sense that you might not necessarily have to come, let's say, all the way to Rose University and go to a certain office and sit at a certain workstation. Because if we have to be honest, research collaborations involve people in various parts of the world. Not everyone would be willing to come to your home university. So you might actually want to use software system that allows people to log in remotely to the trusted research environment. An example of that is something that is known as data shield. To the best of my knowledge, it's not something that we have in place at the institution, but as we roll out our research data management offerings, these are things that are worth considering going forward. But the key thing to know is that for your very, very sensitive research data, you would want to use a trusted research environment in cases where you don't want the information to actually just be leaked out. You want people to use the data in an environment where statistical disclosure mechanisms can be applied to make sure that the data have actually been de-identified without necessarily losing their utility. Are there any questions before we go into the data management planning section of the session?
So these key points we have to subscribe that.
Yeah, an institution would have to, but I think that one would have to be an institutional where the university gets the license, as opposed to you as an individual downloading on your computer. I think the data shield option might maybe be more optimal because it's open source, so it wouldn't really cost an institution that grows too much, I would imagine, because there's no subscription cost. You just have to look at the upkeep aspects from the software management aspect. Someone has to still manage the software and make sure that it's actually secure. That would probably be the better option versus Keypoint. Not that Keypoint is not a good tool, but the cost aspect. And Data Shield is used by several organizations in Europe, several prominent universities, as far as I'm aware. I should have actually had Data Shield in these examples. So let's look at what I've mentioned previously, and this is really for the benefit of anyone who's missed out on the data management planning sessions. What I said is that you all circle back to your data management plan, which is a priori description of how data will be used or handled both during and after a research project. And what you do is at the beginning of the research project, you formulate your data management plan, and during the process of the research project, you update this plan. So once you arrive at this stage, what you'll be focusing on is stage 5, which is data sharing and long-term preservation. And what you see on the screen is really the structure of the data management plan based on what are known as the core requirements for data management plans. And there's also the aspect of fair data principles, that is findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reusability. Now, the data can be found if they have things such as digital object identifiers, but obviously for your sensitive data that have not been published yet, they wouldn't meet most of these criteria. They can't be found, or at least they should not be found. They can be accessible, obviously, to a certain degree, but not openly. They should be interoperable and at least reusable. But these things come into play at the end of the research projects, more so than during the research project itself. And as I pointed out previously, we're looking at data that will be closed and fair in this case. After the de-identification process, then the data will be open and fair if they've been managed properly. And as I indicated previously, there's a connection between the core requirements of the data management plans on the one hand and the fair data principles on the other hand. And the intersection can actually be seen if you look at the light blue columns here. Now, the data management plans can be developed or created by using several types of software platforms. And the one that I indicated is a very good one to use is Fair Wizard, because it is designed to be compliant with fair data principles from the ground up. It allows you to generate or to complete what is known as a smart form by filling in a questionnaire. And then the output is a data management plan. So you complete that questionnaire, and the system does actually have metrics that illustrate the degree to which a researcher has actually complied with the fair data principles, as you can see here. Now, if we go back to the core requirements of DMPs, what I wanted to indicate is that the specific requirements that would be relevant today would be the ones that fall under Section 5, more specifically 5A and 5D. Now, previously I've shown you that there is a template that allows you to translate the core requirements into a data management plan, and it actually provides some kind of guidance in terms of the type of information that must be provided in the data management plan. So insofar as Section 5 is concerned, you basically have to provide information with regards to how and when the data will be shared, and whether or not there are any possible restrictions to data sharing or any embargo reasons. So what I want to point out is that this deals with data sharing as well as data dissemination. So there's a reason why I drew that distinction at the very beginning, because we would ignore the data dissemination or publication components here and just focus on the data sharing ones. The data publication ones will be the focus of the next session, which is actually in 2 weeks' time. And the focus here would really be on providing information on explaining how the data would be discoverable and shared, or rather, on the use of secure data services such as a tree or encryption or file sender by way of example, as well as indicating who will be able to use the data, if it is necessary to restrict access to certain communities or to apply data sharing agreement. You need to explain this, how and why, and explain what action will be taken to overcome or to minimize the risks or restrictions. Now, if you were completing such a data management plan, the kind of information that you provide will relate to the systems that you would use. So the most appropriate ones will be either, let's say, open science framework or file sender, or if there was a trusted research environment at the institution, that's what you would actually mention there. Or you could indicate that I'm going to use a trusted research environment. Then the second component is the bottom part here, which really has to look at who will actually be able to access the data. This has more to do with access control, which is something that we discussed yesterday within the context of role-based access control. And I'm not going to rehash the details once again. It's something that I've already previously mentioned, but this is where this information fits into the data management plan. So I've not just mentioned all this information in an abstract sense. Ultimately, this information makes its way into your data management. You would also look at the 5 safes, and so you can mention things such as things referring to the project, the people being able to exit the project, the specific settings, the software that will be used, how the data will be kept safe, and if you're going to de-identify the data, how the outputs would actually be exported or published in a way that is not disclosed, that does not compromise the confidentiality of the research participants. So in short, you will actually mention how your management of the research data adheres to the 5 safety principles. If you're going to use a trusted research environment, you would mention that as well, and the manner in which you use the trusted research environment. You're going to use in fact, ideally, you'd use a data transfer agreement, even within the context of a trusted research environment. You would actually explain that as well. Now, so far as how this relates to the fair data principles, what I wanted to indicate is that everything that you mentioned here, that is under 5A and 5D, ties in with the findability component, the accessibility components, as well as the interoperability component, or even usability component. So what I've done is I've mapped these out specifically, so that is core requirement 5D, wherever it pops up here, I've identified it, and wherever core requirement 5A is visible, I've also identified that. So you can see the mapping is apparent there. And ultimately, you'd have your data management plan being able to generate, once you complete it, you see the metrics, the visual representation of these radar graphs that indicate the degree to which your DMP, data management plan, actually complies with the fair data principles and indirectly with the core requirements of the data management plan. Now, for practical demonstration, this will be very, very brief. I'm not going to complete the entire data management plan. What I will do is I will just show you the relevant part. So that would be, let's call this section 5 or chapter 5, which is really where you'd complete 5A and 5D. So if you looked at 5A, that is your data sharing strategy, you'd have to answer the following question. What is the plan for making the data discoverable, accessible, and ready for long-term preservation? Remember, this refers to data sharing and dissemination. However, 5A does have options that focus specifically on data sharing. So the first option is, I plan to deposit the data in a trustworthy certified data repository. It's not applicable from a data sharing standpoint. The second one is, I plan to make the data immediately available as supplementary data files. It's not relevant yet in this case. Because I plan to apply an embargo period. Not really relevant. Say, well, I plan to use the data availability statement to clearly define which parts of the data sets will be shared openly and which parts will be restricted due to legal or ethical constraints. That one is partially relevant for the second part, where there's data that has to be restricted due to legal or ethical reasons. So you want that to be stipulated in the data availability statement. That is when the data have already been published. So I'll click that one. The next option is, though, I plan to make the data available as standalone data paper. That's for publication purposes. So I'll stick to the previous one here if we're looking at it from secure data management standpoint. Secure data sharing standpoint. We skip the preservation planning one because that's for data that are being published. Data selection criteria, skip that. Future use consideration, skip that. Identification and citation, skip that. What about tracking and indexing? In this case, that is not really relevant. So the rest of these, what you find is that they're more relevant for the purposes of data that have actually been published. So this template only has questions that are associated with 5A, B, and C, but not 5D. And as I indicated in the presentation slide, the only relevant ones for secure data sharing are 5A and 5D. So we won't actually fill that in here. But in a more complete template, there would be questions related to that. So if we go back to the presentation now, we were close to finishing off. And I'll end off by going through the research data management support services at Rose University for those who are not aware of them. If you want to find out more information about research data management, you can have a look at the Research Data Management Library Guide, which does provide information about various aspects of research data management. If you want to gain a bit more insight about the secure sharing of research data, you can actually play the Research Data Management Adventure game. I believe it is the 4th level, which actually has aspects related to data sharing as well as data publication. And even level 3, which deals with the management of sensitive data, especially from a data storage perspective. So I'd say levels 3 and level 4, each of those levels will take about 10 and 15 minutes to play. You don't need to have any knowledge or detailed knowledge of research data management in order to play those 2 levels. And then there's the aspect of support services that are offered by the library. We do have data stewardship services. We can review data management plans. Since we don't have any data management planning software that's available institutionally, we do manage research data within our institutional data repository. We curate the data as well. But for the purposes of secure sharing of research data, you can have consultations with us, or you can attend related training sessions such as this one if you want to gain a bit of insight about this solutions that you can use. If you want a bit more insight into how some of these tools actually work, then you can schedule a consultation, or you can have a look at the library guide, or you could even look some of these things up, such as File Center, to see how they work, or literally just play with the tools, because File Center is something that is relatively straightforward to use. If you want to contact me or my colleague Tovia Tepa, you can see our email addresses on the presentation slide that is visible at the moment. And with that, that brings me to the end of this presentation. Are there any questions, comments, ideas? Anyone here or anyone who's attending the session virtually? So File Sender is like WeTransfer in a way, but for data sharing purposes, I'd say it's probably better. But yes, it's pretty much like WeTransfer in the sense that it's a file It's a file transferring system. If there are no questions, I would encourage you to actually have a look at the DMP tool as well as to complete the assessment. I believe my colleague Toby will actually share the link in the session. So this will be the summative assessment to see what it is that you've actually gained from this session. As I've indicated in the prior sessions, we actually want to map this so that we can see whether people are still at a beginner level, foundation, intermediate, advanced, or at a proficient level, just so that we can actually assess the effectiveness of these sessions. So we like to work with the research data too. This is not a research project where we plan on publishing anything as of yet, but we really want to see how we can actually improve these sessions based on the skills that are actually being developed within the attendees who actually come to attend these sessions. And if there's nothing else further, then that brings me to the end of the session. Thank you very much for attending. I appreciate it.